Man, I love coming to Bradley County on Veterans Day. I was here in 2017 and I spoke, and after that event, a man comes up to me named Jack Murphy, and he's holding an ice cream in one hand and an old beat up copy of The Old Breed in the other hand. And The Old Breed, that's a book about the Marine First Marine Division, and how they fought through the Pacific Ocean during World War II. And the stories in that book, they were about Jack Murphy. He lived that stuff. And so we went down to, a couple of weeks later, Blaine back in the back there, my trusty photographer friend back there, we went and sat down with him. He told us we did 2 stories on him, so many stories. He just kept telling story after story after story, fascinating stuff. And he was just cool, man. He, in 2020, he went to vote in his dress blues. He was in his 90s, and he's out there voting his dress blues. And then he passed away in December 2020. And that's sadly, that's a big part of what we're doing here, telling these stories. We're trying to capture them while these guys are still here, because we're losing them too fast. And if we can capture a little bit of that story after they're gone, we can still have a piece of them here with us. And I think it's important that we remember that history and remember those people, and remember what they've done. And also, if you got one of those aging warriors in your family, love on them. Love on them, because there's going to be a day that comes that you're going to want to love on them and they're not here. And so that's important. Just make sure that they know how much you appreciate them. And so Price of Freedom is that's what we call the series of stories we do on veterans, and we love doing it. And it really is the most rewarding work I've ever done. We've got a chance to talk to World War II heroes and Medal of Honor recipients and some amazing people. But I served. I know a lot of you guys served. It's not always about those guys who get the headlines, right? It's about the entire veteran community and kind of the need. We got that making a little noise there. Is that better if I hold it? Maybe that works a little better. The need is great, right? It is huge. And today I want to tell you a story about a couple of veterans and kind of what they went through, who aren't war heroes, but boy, their story is important. And it starts just after World War II, right kind of the area where Jack Murphy served, right in that Pacific Ocean area, and it's specifically in the Marshall Islands, even more specifically the Enewetak Atoll. And an atoll is a group of islands that's in a circle, right? And so after World War II, the UN gave the U.S. Permission to kind of oversee those islands. And what they did was they tested atomic and nuclear weapons there. And so they launched those weapons from those northern islands to those southern islands. And obviously, you can't do that if there are people there. So they had to send all those Marshallese people away. And a lot of them came to America, and they live today. In November 2022, right? They live in Arkansas and Oklahoma and Washington State and these places. So 20 years later, there's still nobody living there. We're talking late 70s at this point. And the government decides we got to figure out a way to get those guys back in their home islands. So they come up with a plan to go in and clean those islands up. And to do that, they start figuring this out that, number one, folks don't want to go in there, right? It's radioactive waste. It's nuclear atomic fallout, all that stuff. It's dangerous. And it's very expensive. So what does the government do? They go to the Department of Energy and they find some contractors and some folks that are going to oversee what's going on. And for the heavy lifting, they find service members. And they send those guys in there. Navy, Army, Air Force, they send those guys in there. And for 4 years, they cleaned what they could of those islands, right? And I know this story because I talked to 2 people who were there who lived it, and 2 guys who live in this area. I talked to a lot more than that, but I've talked to 2 guys extensively. One guy's named Bucky Holmes, who lives in Cleveland, and there's a guy named Carlos Vela, who lives in Dalton, and they've told me their stories extensively. And what they say happened was, so they sent about 8,000 service members over there over a period of 4 years. And they're all there for 6 months, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on your time. And they specifically focused on about 3 islands. They lived on one called Lojua, and they cleaned up these other 2 islands, one called Injabi and one called Ruinit. Now Ruinit, it had a giant radioactive crater, right? And so the plan was to clean up Injabi and Ruinit and some other islands and dump all that radioactive waste into that crater. Put it in there and then seal it with a concrete dome. So that's what they did. And so they go there and they do this work, but they weren't trained to do this work. They weren't, scientists. They weren't they weren't engineers. They weren't trained in environmental cleanups, that kind of stuff. They were soldiers, right? So they go over there and they start taking all that stuff and they put it in the crater there. But they weren't trained and they weren't well protected either. And Bucky Holmes shows me a letter, a commendation letter, telling him how great he did during that mission. And in the letter it says he had an anti-contamination suit, is what they called it. Had that the whole time he was there. And I asked him, did you have a suit? And he goes, I didn't have a suit. Never saw a suit. He was over there in his boots and his shorts and a gas mask sometimes. And the boots had these rubber covers over them, right? And so all their skin's exposed, and half the time they're breathing stuff. Not everybody had a gas mask even. A lot of guys wore shirts and handkerchiefs and stuff over their face. So they're getting all this soil and radioactive debris on them. They're breathing it. I talked to Carlos. Now his job was to clean up an island called Injabi. And so how'd you get the stuff to the crater on Ruinit? Well, we put it on a boat, right? They put it on the boat to get it over to where the crater was. But some stuff didn't fit on a boat. So what'd you do with that stuff? Well, we threw that into the lagoon. You got a circle of islands, and you got a body of water in the middle. Well, they threw stuff in the lagoon. That's what he was told to do. These guys were 18, 19, 20, young guys. As you know, if you serve, if you're an 18-year-old soldier and the guy is in charge says throw that stuff in that hole or throw that stuff in that water, you do it, right? They weren't told how dangerous this material was. And so that's what they did. And on top of that, the boats that carried them back and forth to these islands, that's the same boat they put the dirt on. So after the boat goes from Injabi to Ruinit and dump the dirt, well, they got back on the boat and just rode the boat back home. And so everywhere they go, they are around this stuff, covered in dust all the time. Their boots and their gear, all of it's just covered in this stuff all the time. And to take it even further, right, not only is it on their skin and they're breathing it, they set up, so there's nobody who's lived in these islands for 20 years. There's not a lot of infrastructure. So they set up a desalination system, right, that pumps the water out of that lagoon and filters it, and they're making Kool-Aid and tea and soup, and they're taking showers in it, and they're drinking it. So they're breathing it, it's on their skin, and they're ingesting it, right? This is atomic and nuclear fallout from nuclear weapons testing, right? This is not stuff that you want to be touching, much less drinking. And so they did all that. They did their job. They did what they were asked to do. And so they go home, right? You go home. And most of them are fine for a while. Some are not. Some get sick pretty quick. About 8,000 service members were sent. About half of them lived in those southern islands. And even today, nobody lives there. From 1940s, when they started the testing, to today, the only time anybody's lived on those southern islands was 77 to 80, when our service members and DOE contractors were over there. It's the only time people have lived there. It's uninhabitable. You cannot live there. And our guys were there for that period of time. And so they go on with their lives. And Bucky is in his 30s, and his teeth start falling out. And Carlos is 40, and he breaks his back. And his doctor says, you got the bones of a 90-year-old. He's 40. He's got the bones of a 90-year-old. Something happened to him, right? Yeah, something did happen to him. And then over the years, COPD, heart attack, cancer, all these things. Not only that, once you get that stuff in your system, things loud. When you get that stuff in your system, right, you can pass it on to your children. And so their kids start coming down with illnesses that are unexplained. Carlos lost a son, young son, strong, young son. Was it because of the radiation? Well, Carlos believes it was. Can you prove that, well, this is what caused this? How do you do that, right? How do you even do that? So they go to the VA. I'm sick. I served during this time. A lot of this stuff was classified until like the 90s, right? So a lot of them didn't even know what they were exposed to. They didn't know all the things. And then when they declassify it, nobody calls them and says, hey, here's some classified information that you may want to know. Nobody does that, right? So, and it's in the 90s, early 2000s. They don't have the internet. They don't have Facebook. It doesn't exist. Internet exists, but people don't have it in their homes like they do today. You don't have Facebook for sure, right? So the VA's not covering this stuff. And even when I talked to Carlos early this year, he had tried to get disability and he got 0%. Zero. All that stuff he's been through, he got a 0 rating. So then this summer, right, they passed the PACT Act. And if you know anything about that, it's a really great piece of legislation, right? It expands the number of people that are presumed to have been exposed to toxins. And the Enewetak Clean-up Veterans are in there, as are Camp Lejeune Marines who drank the contaminated water, as are the Thailand guys who served during Vietnam and were exposed to the Agent Orange and the herbicides and that stuff. So it expands the number of people who can go to the VA and get some help. And expands the list of illnesses, right? There's a lot more illnesses on that list. And so that's great. It's going to help a lot of people. But the problem is what if you're not on the list? What if you have something that's bad, but it's not on the list? Well, you're in the same boat that you were before. And what about the last 40 years that you've suffered through all this stuff? Well, you're not getting anything for any of that stuff. And so I say all this to just say this, is that, man, there are so many veterans out there who have been through so much, stuff we don't even know about, we're just learning about, that veterans need help. Veterans need help as much as we can help them. And so with these stories that I do, my plan and my hope is to shine a light on those areas that don't get any light, right? And shine a light on those people who aren't on those lists. Because even if you hear the number 22 veterans a day commit suicide, right? And then you hear another stat that says, well, it's more like 20. Well, actually, it could be a little more than that, depending on what study you see, right? It's hard for people to kind of think, oh, we're doing better. Or maybe not believe. Maybe you hear a story like Bucky Holmes' story, and you think, well, that can't be right. That doesn't sound right to me. How can that happen? How have I never heard of that? Well, if you don't think it's true, that's Bucky right there. He'll tell you what's going on. He'll tell you his story. Ask him his story. How about a Veterans Day round of applause for Bucky Holmes right there?
Being hurt in the back, and you're
Okay.
feedback by holding it. Just let it go.
Okay. All right. I was told to let it go, so maybe that'll be better. So I asked Bucky to come today, and the reason is because I love Bucky and Carlos. Those guys are awesome. And I also want them to never feel alone, right? I don't want them ever to walk through this earth, going through what they've been through, and feel alone. I also promised him that I'm not going to shut up about his story, because people need to hear that story. People need to hear that story, because it's one of those that grabs you. It really does. And another thing too about all of it, and I'll wrap up with this, is they're a couple of the most thoughtful people that I know. It's interesting, right? Sometimes the folks who are in the darkest places shine that brightest light, right? I'm going to say that again. The folks who go through the darkest things or in the darkest places shine the brightest light. And these guys are thoughtful people. And that's my ask of you today. Be thoughtful. Think about the ones who came before us. Think about the ones who are going to come next. Think about the ones who were here in this room. Think about the ones who are supposed to be in this room, who told you they were going to come today, who didn't show up because it's raining outside, but you know that's not why they came, or that's why they didn't come, rather. You know that's why they're not here, right? They really don't like to be in crowds. They don't like to talk to people. Check on them today. Call them. Knock on their door. Go see about them. Make sure they're okay. Think about those folks. And think about Bucky and Carlos and all the folks who need something, who probably aren't getting it. And I know that a lot of folks in this room can identify with that message, who have needed something, whether it's from a friend or the VA or somebody else that they never asked for and aren't going to ask for, but they need it anyway. So check on them. Have a great Veterans Day. God bless you, and thank you for letting me be here and come and talk to you guys today.
Thank you, Mr. Rose.